Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And this is the second part in a series that we're doing on President and Supreme Court Chief Justice William Howard Taft. In our previous episode, we sort of looked at the life of Taft and a little bit about his presidency, mostly his life. In this episode, we want to come back to Taft and we want to look at him as Supreme Court Justice. Because Taft is a very unique individual. And one of the reasons he's unique in American history is he's the only man in American history to be both President of the United States and to serve on the Supreme Court, specifically Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So this is a very unique individual. And I think, especially as his role as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a very important person in American history.
Yeah, and we go back to some of the things we talked about in the last episode on Taft. And the reality is Taft himself said, I don't want to be president. I didn't want to be president. It was the worst 4 years of his life, according to his daughter. However, when he receives the appointment to not just the Supreme Court, but he actually has the opportunity to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, it's in that moment that he really finds his, I guess, place in life, if you will. Taft will go on to say, when he finally receives his opportunity to serve on the bench, he says in 1925, the truth is that in my present life, I don't remember that I ever was president. Yeah. That he's just not interested in his presidency, even though he did a lot of really good things. But this is the bread and butter. This is what his whole life has been aiming for. And he finally gets to achieve the dream that he wanted and not the dream that his wife wanted or the dream that even Roosevelt wanted. You know, this is what Taft gets to be. And I think it's really interesting, the importance that Taft has, even in today's society. Some of the things that I guess, you know, and our listeners, when we say the Taft Court, we're referring to that period of time in which Taft was the Chief Justice. Like in today's society, we would say it's the Roberts Court. Many people remember the Warren Court, especially during the Kennedy days. So we call it that as the Chief Justice, his last name, and it's the court that makes those opinions, if you will.
Yeah, and Taft, like you said, Chris, he wanted to be on the court. And, you know, he left the White House in 1913, and he's nominated to the Supreme Court in June of 1921 by President Warren Harding. And I think this is the first Supreme Court nomination that Warren Harding does. So Harding nominates him to the court as Chief Justice in June of 1921. And it's interesting that when the Senate took up the case of Taft's nomination, which of course anyway, when they took up Taft's nomination, they confirmed him with only 4 negative votes. In other words, 96 senators voted to support Taft as Chief Justice Supreme Court, and only 4 didn't. I would bet, Chris, there are no modern day justices that are going to get that kind of support from the Senate.
Yeah, I think, you know, our listeners have had the opportunity to see not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 prospective individuals achieve a spot on this illustrious bench. The Supreme Court only has 9 spots on it. And during the presidency of Trump, he had the opportunity to put 3 individuals on. President Biden, due to the retirement of Justice Breyer, which we talked about in a previous episode, has now selected an individual to possibly become the first African-American woman to serve on the bench. And while her credentials are impeccable, we live in a society that is all about politics. And even though the court is not supposed to be political, I agree with your assessment that politics is going to drive this vote. I just, no matter how good she is, I just don't see 96 senators because of their own political careers being able to vote for her despite qualifications.
Yeah, and this is a time when Taft was nominated in 1921, and I don't want to give the impression that American politics has ever been anything but a blood sport. It has always been a rough and tumble game. American politics has been, but this was a time when Taft was nominated to the court, where you didn't have the internet, you didn't have social media, you didn't have the 24-hour news networks or commentary networks, whatever you want to call them. You didn't have the talk radio. You didn't have so much of what I think puts people in these modern day sort of silos, information silos, where they only hear one side of the story. Now, again, that's not to say that in 1921 politics was easy or anything like that, but it is to say I think we live in a different time where people are more, I don't know that the word partisan is correct, but people are more ideologically rigid in some way.
And I mean, Taft did something extraordinary, because whereas, we're talking about this, just political blood sport, if you will, as you just mentioned, Taft was able to do something just about unheard of in today's Supreme Court opinions. In today's Supreme Court, you're seeing a lot of these cases in 5-4, maybe 6-3. They're very politically based. But what made Taft such a great Chief Justice is he was adamant that any case that was going to be heard, he was going to do everything that he could to have unanimous votes. He wanted the nation to see that the 9 of us, after studying the Constitution, after hearing the arguments, it's our goal to ensure that we are together, that we don't have a lot of dissents. He couldn't stand dissenting opinions, and those are the opinions in which the justices who are on the losing side, if you will, they would write and give these long soliloquies about how terrible an opinion it was. Taft didn't want that. And there's a record that says, and this actually came from Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman to be on the Supreme Court. She said Taft was a great justice who deserves almost as much credit as John Marshall, who basically set it up for the court's modern day role, but who does not often receive the same recognition, because 84% of the Taft court's opinions were unanimous, which I just think is, as you've just said, it's unheard of that you've got a guy who was able to take 9 individuals and over some really controversial cases have 9-0 votes. Regardless of what it was. Of course, he keeps his conservative legacy, but still, to get 9 people to view in support of that, I think is a notable compliment that probably doesn't get discussed enough about Taft's legacy.
And I think it's a credit to his knowledge of the law, but also to his personality. A very friendly, very outgoing person, which unfortunately was lost during his presidency. And when he gets to the court, it's back. He's the Taft people knew before he became president again.
And the people on the bench, as well as the clerks and others, they really enjoyed him, and he enjoyed being with them. The court today, they have these weekly conferences, and it's when the 9 of them get together and they discuss, if they're going to have the case or talk about cases. But John Roberts, who is the current Chief Justice, is really trying hard to have that same Taft mentality, because it sets a principle that this is not a controversial ruling. This is the ruling, and we're all on the same page, whether we're Republicans, Democrats, whether we're Catholic or Protestant or Jewish, we all feel the same way. And that is something that Roberts, I think, really, really, really wants, because he knows that he needs that in today's society. And he's following the Taft legacy, because think about when Taft is Chief Justice. I mean, it's during a lot of political issues. I mean, we've just come out of a war. We're in the Great Depression. We're getting ready to go to another world war. So you've got all of that going on internationally, and then at home you're trying to keep the nation alive. So it needed to be 9-0, and I think Taft understood that part.
Yeah, and Roberts has got a much more difficult, I think, job as far as trying to keep everybody on the same sheet of music than Taft would have, I think.
Yeah, and and I think it's interesting to see that the Chief Justice spot was much, I don't want to say easier, but I think it was easier for Taft than the presidency was. But one thing that he does do, which is important for us to talk about today, is he expands federal power, and that's this federal power where the government has more control over a lot of different things that are going on, and that's huge. But there are a few other things that he does, and I don't know how deep we want to get into some of the stuff, but there was one decision that he makes. It was called Myers versus the United States. I don't know if you want to talk about that one. So maybe let's just dig into that just a little bit and kind of talk about why that was so important, because that is a significant detail of expanding federal power.
Yeah, it's probably one of the most important cases that his court issued a decision on. The decision was issued on October 25, 1926. And basically this decision, the case of Myers versus the United States, it goes back to something we've already talked about on this podcast, and that was the 1876 Tenure of Office Act. And there was this guy in 1920, a guy called Frank Myers, who was a postmaster in Portland, Oregon. He was basically fired by President Woodrow Wilson in 1920. And Wilson did not get permission from the Senate to fire Myers. So Myers worked through a series of challenges to his dismissal, and it eventually made its way up to the Supreme Court, where Taft would issue a decision. And speaking of it being, him liking majority decisions, this was a 6-3 decision. He only had 3 dissents, which is pretty good.
I mean, absolutely, to basically tell the Senate what they couldn't do. I mean, that's a huge moment. And so that was, as you say, that was one of the most important ones. But I think, once again, that just shows Taft's view or value of the Constitution. There were times in which Taft's role as Chief Justice sort of conflicted with some of the things that had happened even during his presidency. I mean, I thought one of the interesting things what Taft did is Taft usually voted to uphold limitations on the government's power to regulate businesses. For instance, there was one thing that he did when he struck down a tax on companies that use child labor. So that was a big decision that the court did. But there were also other things. I mean, he voted to uphold an Oregon law that created a 10-hour maximum workday for women. I mean, so he sees kind of where society is, but he's not willing to budge from what the law allows and what the law calls for.
Yeah, in some ways, he's very conservative in his approach. He was that way as president, seems that way as a Chief Justice. But in other ways, he does have a progressive side to him.
Yeah, I don't know. Did you do any research about Taft and Prohibition? So it was pretty interesting, because Taft, when he was kind of president, things of that nature, even Prohibition was in 1919 during the Wilson administration, I think, right? I think that's right. And so Taft was against Prohibition. He just didn't like Prohibition because he was pretty smart. He was like, well, how can you enforce Prohibition? Which, I mean, it's very difficult to enforce Prohibition when you had the speakeasies and you had Al Capone, and they're sitting there pouring the alcohol down the sewer, but had buckets underneath the sewer to catch it and then selling it in the speakeasy. And Taft knew that. He said, how are you going to enforce prohibition? But what he did do when he was Chief Justice is he consistently approved strict enforcement of anti-liquor laws. Now, why is that fascinating to me? I think it's fascinating because of one reason. His wife was totally against Taft's support of anti-liquor laws because his wife loved a good drink. He was dry. He didn't drink, but his wife covered for both of them. And there's even a story that's told when they were in London that the U.S. ambassador and Helen Taft, Taft's wife, got wasted drinking beer. And the Chief Justice and the ambassador's wife actually said, we spent a nice evening drinking water, eating cheese and crackers. So his wife was just like really all for drinking. Taft was, strongly against it because he said, well, that's what the law says, and we've got to uphold the law, which you kind of find interesting, right? Because his wife is pushing him to be president. His wife is pushing him to do all of these things. But once he gets past the presidency, it's kind of like, hey, you had your glory of 4 years in the White House. I'm now Chief Justice. Sit back and let me ride. I'm going to do what I need to do.
Yeah, you do see in some of his rulings, going back to Myers v. United States, one thing that struck me about that one is it was about presidential power. Did the president have the power to outright fire a cabinet member?
Mm-hmm.
Approved by the Senate. The Tenure of Office Act from 1876 said no. Taft in this decision said, yeah. And he goes back, to the Constitution in 1787, and he goes back to the first Congress in 1789, and he makes a pretty strong argument, in my opinion anyway, that the president does have this power, that the Tenure of Office Act was really a violation of separation of power. So, you're talking about his view of prohibition maybe while he was president, then his view of it while he was Chief Justice of the court. I think also you see where his decision on the court, at least in Myers v. United States, it was interesting coming from a man who had been president of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, actually, having been in that chair and then kind of ruling, the way that he did. But Myers versus U.S., that was one of the most important ones during his legacy with the Taft court, but it probably wasn't the most controversial one. Mm-hmm. I think our listeners would be interested to know that in 1928, the Taft court was dealing with a case that was called Olmstead versus U.S. And not getting into all of the specifics of Olmstead versus U.S., but Taft wrote the opinion, and it was a 5-4 decision. He won it 9-0s, but this one he couldn't get, and I think our listeners will understand why. But in a 5-4 decision, Taft and the other 4, to get the 5-4, Taft wrote the opinion that allowed warrantless wiretaps of phone conversations to be used against defendants. And that decision caused a national uproar, which rightfully so, right? Yeah. I mean, because where do you get the right to say that you don't need a warrant to wiretap your phone? I have these conversations all the time with students in class when we're talking about Supreme Court cases, and they want to know about student rights. And we talk about Tinker versus Des Moines. We talk about free speech and Griswold. We talk about all of these different cases, right? And students are always fascinated with what they can say and what they can do. And then I go to the question, about their phones. Mm. And when you start talking about their phones and access, and do you have access to your phone? Does administration have access to your book bags? All of these things. And all of a sudden, no, I've got freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of privacy. You can't just come in. But in 1928, Taft actually said, hey, if we think that you're doing something illegal, they don't have to have a warrant to sit there and find out about you. Now, that actually will be overturned in 1967.
Yeah.
But it took that many years for something like that to be turned over.
You know, you talk about your students and their phones, and I can see where that would, but in 1928, I think phones were probably very much like the internet in the early mid 2000s, and smartphones now is sort of it's sort of a wild west. So, now we look at Taft's ruling and we shrink back in horror. Oh my gosh, I mean, people always concerned. I remember during the administration of George W. Bush, what was it, the Patriot Act?
Yeah.
And allegedly they could trace what library books you were checking out or something like that. And people were horrified. Now you've got, in 1928, a court ruling that said basically, yeah, they can just spy on you without. But of course, back in those days, Chris, didn't a lot of people have party lines anyway? I mean, so you didn't really have a secret conversation on the phone.
Yeah, because you always had the operator listening in. That was number one.
Well, you had the operator, but also you had all the people in town.
If our listeners, if listeners want a really good understanding of how the early telephones work, Andy Griffith has a really good episode on that, right? Yeah. And you can just, I mean, it is what you used to say, the party line, and people would be listening in, and that would cause them to call somebody else.
But there was the businessman who came through Mayberry in that episode, and he's, his car breaks down and it's Sunday, so there's nobody there to work on the car, and he's at Andy's house, which who would take a stranger like that? But anyway, he takes him to his house, and the man's trying to call Charlotte or something, and he's like these two elderly women on the phone, and he says, like, I'm trying to talk, and they're like, hello. So yeah, I mean, I don't reckon there was much realistic idea that you would have privacy in 1928, but certainly, that's one of those rulings that it doesn't surprise me at all that it was overturned, and today it would be viewed very differently.
Yeah. So, I mean, he was very influential in many different court cases, as, gosh, I think Taft himself, he served on the court for 9 years.
Yeah.
And Taft himself wrote 249 opinions for the court. Out of those 294 opinions that Taft wrote, he only dissented 20 times, and he only wrote 4 written dissents. Every Supreme Court case nowadays always has somebody writing a dissent. Mm-hmm. But Taft didn't feel that. If he said no, he said no. And that's just what it was. He didn't have to explain. But in today's society, we do have to explain. There's 2 other things I would mention about Taft with the court before I ended on my end is, he was a solicitor general. That's the other thing. As we talked about last time, his rise up, into all of the different things. One of the things was that he was the Solicitor General of the United States. And, Solicitor Generals are those ones who basically are, would you say that they're the lead lawyer, I guess is the right word for that? Is that accurate? Yeah. And what's interesting is that he's the only former U.S. solicitor to become president, which means he's the only, one to become president and Chief Justice. But there's only been 5 solicitor generals who have joined the Supreme Court. And the last one was Elena Kagan, who is one of the current Supreme Court justices that's on there now. So that's a little interesting side bit trivia that people can use. The second thing that I would share is that Taft was the one who went to Congress and said, we got to get out of here. We've got to leave because the court during this time was meeting in the old Senate chamber of the Capitol, and it was dark and dank and dusty, and it was where everybody didn't want to go. And so he actually convinces Congress to fund the construction of what we know as today as the Supreme Court building. And they were able to move out of there. And Taft doesn't live to see it open, because I think it opens in 1935, I think is when it opens. But it is interesting that that building moving out of the Capitol, and maybe, Ray, there's something to this, that it was another sign of Taft understanding the need for there to be separation of the branches of government. That even though it was physically in the same building as the legislative branch, and therefore moving it out, and it's across the street nowadays, from the Capitol, in a beautiful building. If anybody's has the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C., me being a constitutional buff, stop by and at least take a look at it. It is marvelous. Maybe we should do a podcast just on that building, because not only is it the highest court in the land, but Ray, it has the highest literal court in the land. There's a basketball court on the top level of the Supreme Court. And it's the place where Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to do her Pilates workouts. It's where Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Alito and some of those guys, they play basketball each week, along with the I just lost what we call them. But the clerks, they play with the clerks, and it's at the very top of the Supreme Court. It's not part of the tour. You got to know somebody to be able to see it. But there's been some knockdown dragouts, when they would have a conference and they couldn't agree on something, they'd say, we'll take it out on the court. And they didn't mean the Supreme Court. They meant the Supreme Basketball Court. So I don't know.
Whoever wins gets the verdict, right?
Yeah. So, but just, the court is so fascinating. And I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with Taft. I mean, just who he was and what he did. And I remember that in 1930, Taft had, what was it? He had a stroke. Is that right? Is that what
he had cardiovascular issues, and he stepped down.
But yet the sad thing is that he wasn't able to deliver the resignation. That actually it was his son that had to deliver the resignation to Hoover. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the great Supreme Court justices, he said about Taft, he said, "Sir, we will call you Chief Justice still, for we cannot give up the title by which we have known you all these later years and which you have made dear to us. We cannot let you leave us without trying to tell you how dear you have made it. You came to us from achievement in other fields and with the prestige of the illustrious place that you lately had held, and you showed us in new form your voluminous capacity for getting work done, your humor that smoothed the tough places, your golden heart that brought you love from every side, and most of all from your brethren whose task you have made happy and light. We grieve at your illness, but your spirit has given an impulse that will abide whether you are with us or away." What a fitting tribute.
Yeah. And his son, Robert Alfonso Taft, he's going to serve in the U.S. Senate after Taft's death. Taft dies in 1930. Alfonso Taft serves in the Senate representing Ohio from 1939 to 1953. And interestingly enough, he tries to run for president, Chris. He tries to get the Republican nomination on 3 occasions in 1940, 1948, 1952, and he failed each time. So the Republican Party wasn't that friendly to the Taft family after Taft left the presidency.
Yeah, and I think the final tribute that over the last 2 podcasts that we've done on Taft should probably come from the great humorist Will Rogers. I think it's a fitting tribute to Taft, in which he says this. He said, "It's great to be great, but it's greater to be human. He, Taft, was our great human fellow because there was more of him to be human. We are parting with 300 pounds of solid charity to everybody and love and affection for all his fellow men." It kind of sums up what we've talked about over the last 2 episodes about Taft. And it's kind of a reminder to us, especially in the political world that we find ourselves involved in and interested in, that at the end of the day, charity, love, and affection for all people should be the main purpose, whether you're sitting on a bench on the Supreme Court, the highest, court in the land, whether you're sitting behind the greatest desk of power in the Oval Office, or whether you're just doing what you've got to do to make society a little bit better, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in the grocery store, whether it's in your home, that all of us, if we just try to do a little bit better and use virtue and truth, we just might make this a better society.
Yeah, and Taft, he is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And I believe, Chris, he's one of only 2 presidents buried there at Arlington, John F. Kennedy and William Howard Taft. I believe they're the only 2. So he's buried there at Arlington National Cemetery. Well, I hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode. Please share it with your family and friends. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter, History You Didn't Know But Should. If you have a show suggestion, topic idea, you can email us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, @gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.